short video, but it's not a YouTube short. Fiber wad, quote unquote, forcing cones. Something that people notice if you look up really old firearms is that they were done in kind of a crude way. You'd mill a barrel to exactly the right diameter, at the minimum diameter, for it to be used for, let's say, a rifle, and then you'd button rifle it by making the scratches or grooves. That's what rifling actually means. It means scratching. To a larger diameter, and then the average of the diameter or surface area or some other equation would tell you the bore diameter. But what was fired through it is what would be going into it. And what comes out of the muzzle is, by definition, its caliber or bore diameter. And with the 12 gauge, that works out to 72.9 caliber, or 0.729 inches. What it really works out to is 73 caliber, or 0.73 inches. When you deal with rifling, it has to start off at 72. So if you're going to do a rifled barrel, you either take a 12 gauge barrel and heat it up and forge it over a mandrel that puts rifling into it, if you're going to do a full bore rifle barrel, or you mill it the other way or run a button rifle through it. Obviously, depending on what you're doing and your sophistication, it's one or the other. But the bore diameter works out at, again, 729. Now, one of the things that people notice is that paper holes or paper shotgun shells that held a fiber wad and didn't use a cup or anything, it just used it as a piston for the pressure behind it to shove everything out of the barrel, sometimes efficiently, sometimes not, depending on how many nitro cards or air pressure quality seal cards you put behind or in front of it. This would act as cushioning, keep it from distorting the shot, etc. But the main thing is, and it's illustrated strongly in this, is that you go from the chamber diameter, which is 0.81 inches, way back here, and then 0.79 or maybe even 0.78 down here, depending on how much taper there is. The tapering is so the shell can be pulled out easily, and when it's pushed in, it definitively creates a gas-tight seal. The quote-unquote forcing cone on most modern shotguns is like half an inch or maybe a little bit shorter, but in older guns, there really wasn't a cone. It was just a sudden change in bore diameter, and they would make it slightly a little bit of an angle. Basically, that's the angle you get off a drill bit. And it would go from the cartridge straight into here, losing almost no gas pressure, and everything would jump this space and have just a little bit of gas loss. But the main thing is the wad and overshot cards and everything else, and the shot column would go smoothly, hypothetically, from a slightly narrowing internal diameter down to this, and go through with the bore of the barrel matching the inside of the shell. Now, plastic holes and brass and even steel holes and aluminum holes are thinner, or can be thinner and lighter, and can hold a larger mass. So a much more deformable medium is needed. Now you have a wad base, which in some cases has little shock absorbers in it. It's plastic. It's usually a shot cup, which makes it to where you can fire steel shot out of a barrel without damaging it, or ever in some cases. And the bore changes are identical, but instead of this sudden change, something had to be done. A thinner plastic hull, usually but not always, equals a larger wad. Sometimes you'd have to have things tapered down to jam fit in it, and this would almost be a forcing cone bore obstruction. Again, it's not really a cone, it's a sudden change. One of the methods for that was actually to put out thicker shells that would be more stiff and more prone to cracking in winter. That's why a lot of people still stuck with waxed paper or just paper wads. They worked, but they also broke up a little more often. But a fiber, thing like that also had another peculiarity. If you fired steel shot and used a paper shot cup and a fiber wad and the nitro cards and that sort of thing to keep the gas seal straightened out, you could get away with firing shot that was eco-friendly. Every single thing was biodegradable. Not a damn thing would hang out more than a couple of months. The steel base or brass bases, if you're traditional like me, would be just big enough to keep the gunpowder, when it's burning, from pitting the sides and actually causing a gas-tight leak. But this increases recoil or perceived recoil, and it also causes a lot of obturation damage to the base and everything. And you will find there are some shotgun shells that have a liner put in them to where it emulates this thicker walled type. It just wears out, and sometimes that gets stuck in the barrel, but you can get better shot patterns because the shot leaves the cartridge, and until it leaves the barrel, it hasn't changed position in some cases. This is especially useful for buckshot. That's the idea. This is what I'm reading lately. I want your input on this. I'm not sure what's going on here because, I mean, I've done a video on this. This is almost identical imaging, by the way. I just realized. But let's go on to something. Is this a compromise, using a forcing cone? Now, I've looked up a couple of reasons people are retroactively deciding that a forcing cone needs to taper over a longer distance. I'm actually in favor of this because it lets you create a very slow change in diameter using a thin-walled shotgun shell down to the bore diameter so that it causes a lot less disruption in what's being fired and it causes a better gas seal. But, again, emphasis added, making the wad and the interior of the shotgun shell exactly the same diameter as what's being shot through the bore means that you have an almost ideal situation. And again, if you're shooting steel, as long as the barrel can tolerate it, or as long as you're using a paper or cardboard shot cup, I'm sure you could create a... wow, could you make a... Wow. Could you make a flight control rod out of paper? Actually, I saw someone do that on YouTube. I take that back. You could do that. So you could literally make an eco-friendly steel shotgun for hunting anything, shoot ball bearings, and just have a very sudden cone to it. Now, this has a bad thing to it again, but we went from that to this. This seems like a compromise and a half because, this is obviously extreme forcing cone change. But the reason I thought about this is, on a flare gun, the plastic flare gun like in PUBG and in reality, it doesn't have a forcing cone. It has an abrupt change from the bore diameter up to the shell diameter at 2 inches. It is an unforgiving plastic shotgun pistol. And yeah, someone actually did an experiment where they lengthened the cone and put a 2-inch mini shell in and actually fired it, and it kind of worked. It still split open and blew the hell up after 2 or 3 shots, but it lasted, well, actually more than 2 or 3 shots. It lasted longer. And that brings up the next thing. This allows you to get away with, if you use a forcing cone that's longer, weaker material. Or in the case of slamfire shotguns made out of Schedule 40 pipe, you can get away with using no forcing cone. The whole barrel is the same diameter as the chamber. Or in the case of one of the weird designs I saw, you taper it from literally the base of the cartridge all the way out to the barrel with the same taper. It never changes diameter abruptly anywhere. And you end up with it mostly preserving it, but only for thin-walled shells, like literally brass shotgun shells or plastic ones. But the chamber length, interesting thing I wanted to bring up here, again, on the abrupt change versus very smooth change, or smooth jazz as I like to call it. If you made it to where every shotgun had a very sudden change instead of this forcing cone, which again seems like it's a compromise, because these didn't kick any worse if they had the inner diameter matching. If in the past people were used to having shells exactly match that, not quite cone shape, but literally the changeover, did that improve its ability to get full speed, exploit the propulsion of the gunpowder or smokeless powder? Did it improve shot patterns? Was it just better? A lot of old FUDs say it does. And that's what brings me to this question. Is that forcing cone a compromise, or should it be gotten rid of and switch over only to thin wall? Now, here's my logic for it. It's undeniable that if you use a sudden changeover for inner diameter of the shell right to the bore, that would be an improvement. But that's not how they are. Your average shotgun shell is around 9 gauge internally, even though it's called something else. It's really big. The cheap ones. And the chamber diameter at 81 down to 79 is really pretty much a 9 gauge. But would it be advantageous to make a sort of staged forcing cone? Hear me out on this. Have it to where it has chamber length, exact chamber length for all the plastic holes and steel holes and brass holes like I like, that does exactly the right diameter, and then does a very sudden forcing cone change only if you put in thick walled. Is there a way to compromise these together where you have a stair-step pattern to the forcing cone? The reason I'm bringing that up is a couple of the chamber reams I've seen for sale have stair-stepped, and it's for a compromise. It's called a compromise shotgun chamber ream and forcing cone ream to make it to where it can stair step it. But it says right on it, you have to trim your shells exactly to length for each type and not crimp them. That means you have to use an overshot card and glue. In here you'll see the SAMI not so compromised dimensions, etc. And this one's 2 3/4, and it shows the chamber lengths have increased, and it shows 3 point something for the full length to the forcing cone. And the forcing cone there is going on for a little over, about 1/4 of an inch plus 1/6, so yeah, it's almost 1/2 inch. And that's part of the standard on SAMI. Now here's the funny thing. Could you, because that's almost exactly 3 inches, rechamber that to 3 inches if the barrel could take it, and have an advantage with 3-inch shells, or whatever the rounded off number would be that you could bore it to? Would that remove some of the kick, even though it seems like it shouldn't? And would it work better with thicker walled shells? More reloadable shells is what I'm talking about. One of the videos I have talks about making shells out of brass tubing, which would necessitate making a very sudden change in the bore because you'd have that wasted space outgassing. The reason I'm bringing this up is I saw a video on a random website. It's not on YouTube, so I'm not even going to link to it. It doesn't load cleanly anyway. That talks about someone trimming his shells to fit, quote, a sudden change in forcing cone or no forcing cone at all, and getting better results. Less kick, less deformation. He was able to reuse his wads if he found them downrange. No damage to anything. Not just the shot, but the shot cup and the gas seals. Everything went from the chamber, the space inside of the shell, straight to the bore, exactly right, even though it squeezed it down a bit, because he had a kind of a forcing cone. So what he did was, he went from the end of the shell to a sudden shelf, and then had a forcing cone down to the diameter. That would be a good compromise, and it would deform things less. If you fired a full-size shot column out of an old-style waxed cartridge, it would fit fine. It would just have a gap that's big, but it's fine. Just use nitro card stack or whatever. And if you were firing thin wall, it would absolutely not hit anything on the edge, but it made it to where you couldn't just kind of round off your shotgun shells. They had to be straight walled, preferably not trimmed or crimped to anything other than perfect fit, and then you would just simply glue in your overshot cards. And one guy even did what he called Black Widow spider or hourglass type, where the shot cups were double-ended, symmetrical, and the bottom of it was filled with propellant and pushed into the cartridge, and then tipped up, and then the shot was poured in, and then an overshot card or thing was put over it. It was the same thing. It made it to where they were kind of a capsule. Anyway, I just wanted to bring this up because this is interesting me, and if you have any comments, please leave them. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with all that.